Imagine a war where bombs weren't the only weapons. What if the most devastating attacks happened inside the minds of soldiers and civilians, quietly eroding their will to fight? This isn't just about battles fought on land, sea, or air. It's about the unseen psychological front that shaped the outcome of World War II in ways you never learned in history class. In the darkness of that global conflict, when millions marched toward uncertainty and entire nations trembled under the weight of aggression, another kind of warfare unfolded silently in the shadows. This was a battle waged not with guns or grenades, but with words, images, rumors, and carefully crafted lies. It crept into living rooms through radio broadcasts, drifted down from the sky on paper leaflets, and whispered through the ranks of exhausted soldiers huddled in trenches. This psychological warfare was invisible yet devastatingly powerful, capable of breaking spirits, turning allies into enemies, and reshaping the very fabric of belief that held nations together. As we journey through this story together, let us move gently through time, exploring how the human mind became both weapon and battlefield, how fear and hope were weaponized with precision, and how the echoes of these invisible wars still ripple through our world today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it must have felt like to live in a world where you couldn't trust what you heard, where every message might be designed to manipulate you, and where the enemy could reach into your thoughts without ever setting foot in your homeland. Long before the Second World War tore across continents, the concept of psychological warfare had already taken root in human civilization. Ancient commanders understood that victory often belonged not to the strongest army, but to the one that could break the enemy's spirit before the first sword was drawn. In the misty valleys of ancient China, the legendary strategist Sun Tzu penned words that would echo through millennia, teaching that all warfare is based on deception and that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. His wisdom recognized something profound about human nature, that the mind can be conquered more completely than the body, and that fear, doubt, and confusion are weapons as sharp as any blade. Across the ancient world, from the steppes where Mongol horsemen thundered across the horizon to the Roman forums where orators swayed crowds with carefully chosen words, leaders grasped the power of perception. The Mongols under Genghis Khan deliberately spread tales of their brutality, ensuring that terror preceded their armies like a cold wind, causing cities to surrender without resistance. Roman generals understood that displays of strength and mercy, used strategically, could win hearts and minds more effectively than prolonged sieges. In medieval Europe, the Crusaders and their opponents both employed religious fervor and propaganda to motivate their followers and demoralize their enemies, painting conflicts not merely as territorial disputes, but as cosmic struggles between good and evil. These ancient practices laid the groundwork for what would become increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. By the time empires rose and fell through the Renaissance and into the Industrial Age, the printing press had revolutionized the spread of ideas, making it possible to reach thousands of minds simultaneously with pamphlets, newspapers, and books. The American Revolution saw both sides employ propaganda to sway public opinion, with patriots like Thomas Paine crafting stirring calls to action while British authorities attempted to portray the rebels as dangerous radicals. The French Revolution demonstrated how powerful ideas could topple ancient monarchies when combined with effective communication to the masses. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this well, using bulletins and proclamations to build his legend and maintain morale among his far-flung armies. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world witnessed the horror of the First World War, a conflict that would prove to be a crucial testing ground for modern psychological warfare techniques. In that brutal war of attrition, where millions died in muddy trenches for gains measured in yards, governments on all sides realized they needed to maintain civilian support and soldier morale through unprecedented means. Propaganda posters appeared on walls across Europe and America, depicting the enemy as monstrous and inhuman, while portraying one's own side as noble and righteous. Newspapers were censored and manipulated to present favorable views of the war's progress. Atrocity stories, some real and many exaggerated or fabricated, circulated widely to fuel hatred and justify continued sacrifice. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the world that emerged from the Great War was fundamentally changed, scarred not only by the physical devastation but by a collective psychological trauma that would shape the decades to come. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at the French Palace, attempted to redraw maps and assign blame, but it also planted seeds of resentment that would grow into thorns. Germany, defeated and humiliated, faced crushing reparations and territorial losses that bred a sense of national grievance. Into this wounded nation stepped voices that promised restoration and revenge, voices that understood how to manipulate the collective psyche of a people desperate for meaning after so much suffering. The 1920s and 30s witnessed the rise of totalitarian regimes across Europe, and each of these governments recognized that controlling information meant controlling reality itself. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party developed elaborate systems of propaganda and censorship, reshaping history to suit current political needs and creating a culture where truth became whatever the state declared it to be. In Italy, Benito Mussolini crafted an image of himself as the embodiment of a resurgent Roman Empire, using pageantry, symbols, and carefully staged public appearances to build a cult of personality. But nowhere was the manipulation of mass psychology more deliberate and effective than in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler had learned from his experiences in the First World War and his subsequent political struggles that emotion, not reason, moved the masses. In his writings and speeches, he openly acknowledged his intention to use propaganda as a weapon, understanding that repetition of simple messages, appeals to primal fears and desires, and the identification of scapegoats could unite a population behind even the most extreme ideologies. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, they immediately established the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels, a man who would become one of history's most infamous masters of psychological manipulation. Goebbels understood modern media in ways that seemed almost prophetic. He recognized that radio could bring a single voice into millions of homes simultaneously, creating a sense of intimate connection between leader and follower. He grasped how film could bypass rational thought and appeal directly to emotions through imagery, music, and narrative. He knew that controlling the flow of information meant controlling reality itself for most people. Under his direction, the Nazi propaganda machine worked tirelessly to reshape German society, promoting ideals of racial purity, national destiny, and absolute loyalty to the Führer. Jews, Roma, communists, and others were systematically dehumanized through relentless messaging that portrayed them as threats to the German people. Youth were indoctrinated through education and organizations like the Hitler Youth. Art, literature, music, and science were all bent to serve the ideological goals of the state. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, nations watched these developments with varying degrees of alarm. Britain, France, and the United States, scarred by the previous war and mired in economic depression, initially hoped to avoid another conflict through appeasement and diplomacy. Japan, driven by its own imperial ambitions and nationalist fervor, expanded aggressively into China, employing both conventional military force and psychological tactics to terrorize populations into submission. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in 1936, became a rehearsal for the larger conflict to come, with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supporting Francisco Franco's nationalist forces while the Soviet Union backed the Republican government. Both sides used propaganda extensively, and the conflict became a proving ground for techniques that would soon be deployed on a global scale. Radio broadcasts, newsreels, posters, and pamphlets all played roles in attempting to win international support and maintain domestic morale. The world was learning that modern warfare would not be confined to battlefields but would extend into every aspect of civilian life, into newspapers and movie theaters, into schools and factories, into the very thoughts and beliefs of entire populations. As the 1930s drew toward their close and Germany's aggressive expansion accelerated, it became clear that another great war was approaching. This time, however, the combatants would be better prepared to fight not only with tanks and aircraft, but with carefully crafted messages designed to manipulate, demoralize, and control. The gathering storm and early maneuvers. When German forces rolled into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, they brought with them not only military might but a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was as much a psychological tactic as a military one, designed to overwhelm and terrorize through speed and violence, leaving defenders too shocked and confused to mount effective resistance. The screaming Stuka dive bombers, fitted with sirens specifically to create a terrifying sound as they attacked, exemplified this approach. Their wailing descents meant to freeze soldiers and civilians with fear. As Poland fell and the world watched in horror, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But the conflict many had dreaded seemed strangely quiet for months. This period, known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, saw little actual combat on the Western Front, but it was far from peaceful in the realm of psychological operations. All sides were busy preparing their populations for the struggles ahead, crafting narratives that would sustain civilian morale and soldier determination through the dark days to come. In Britain, the government established the Ministry of Information, which despite its bland name was essentially a propaganda agency tasked with managing public opinion and countering enemy psychological operations. The British understood that this war would be different from the last, that modern communications technology meant the home front and the battlefront were no longer separate spheres. Every citizen needed to be enlisted in the struggle, not just as workers and soldiers but as believers in the cause. The German propaganda machine, meanwhile, worked to justify each new aggression as defensive or righteous, portraying Germany as a victim of international conspiracies rather than an aggressor. Goebbels' ministry produced films, radio programs, and printed materials that reinforced Nazi ideology while attempting to demoralize enemies and reassure domestic audiences that victory was inevitable. When Germany launched its assault on Western Europe in May of 1940, the psychological impact was devastating. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France all faced the German war machine, and the speed of the conquest shocked the world. The French army, considered one of the finest in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. For the Allies, this represented not only a military disaster but a profound psychological blow. The myth of French invincibility had been shattered, and suddenly it seemed that nothing could stop Hitler's ambitions. Britain now stood alone against Nazi-controlled Europe, and the psychological challenge was immense. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had taken office as France fell, proved himself a master of inspirational rhetoric, understanding that words could serve as weapons in this desperate hour. His speeches, delivered in his distinctive gravelly voice and broadcast across the radio waves, rallied the British people with phrases that would echo through history. He offered not comfort but honest acknowledgement of the struggle ahead, combined with absolute determination never to surrender. When he spoke of fighting on beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills, he was not merely describing military strategy but steeling the national spirit for the ordeal of the Battle of Britain. That summer and autumn of 1940, as German aircraft filled the skies over England and bombs fell on British cities night after night during the Blitz, the psychological dimension of warfare became viscerally real for British civilians. The Luftwaffe's campaign had clear psychological objectives beyond the military goal of achieving air superiority. The bombing of civilian areas was intended to break British morale, to create panic and defeatism that would pressure the government to negotiate peace on German terms. But the campaign had an unexpected result. Rather than breaking, British resolve seemed to harden. The image of Londoners carrying on with daily life, of families sleeping in underground stations while bombs fell above, of St. Paul's Cathedral standing defiantly amid the flames, became powerful symbols of resistance. British propaganda made effective use of these images, portraying the British people as indomitable and the Nazi bombing campaign as barbaric attacks on innocent civilians. Churchill's government carefully managed information about the bombing, neither minimizing the damage so much that people felt deceived nor emphasizing it so much that despair took hold. The BBC, which had developed a reputation for generally accurate reporting, became a trusted voice not only for British listeners but for people across occupied Europe who secretly tuned in to hear news the Nazi authorities tried to suppress. This credibility would prove invaluable as the war progressed, as accurate reporting, even when it included setbacks, built trust that made later positive news more believable and inspiring. As the war expanded and intensified, radio emerged as perhaps the single most important medium for psychological warfare. Unlike printed materials, which required distribution networks and literacy, radio waves crossed borders invisibly, reaching into homes and hearts with the intimacy of a human voice speaking directly to the listener. All the major combatants recognized this power and established broadcasting operations aimed at foreign audiences. The British Broadcasting Corporation established services in dozens of languages, broadcasting news, entertainment, and carefully crafted propaganda to audiences in occupied Europe, neutral countries, and even within Germany itself. The British approach generally favored credibility over blatant propaganda, recognizing that lies would eventually be discovered and undermine trust. This strategy paid dividends as BBC broadcasts became a lifeline for resistance movements and a source of hope for millions living under Nazi occupation. In contrast, German radio operations, while extensive and technically sophisticated, often undermined their own effectiveness through obvious fabrications and bombastic declarations that strained credibility. Lord Haw Haw, the nickname given to William Joyce, an American-born fascist who broadcast Nazi propaganda to Britain from Germany, became infamous for his sneering broadcasts that attempted to demoralize British listeners with claims of German superiority and Allied defeats. His opening phrase, Germany calling," became widely recognized, but rather than demoralizing the British, his broadcasts often provided dark entertainment, and his predictions of British defeat became subjects of mockery as they repeatedly failed to materialize. The United States, before its entry into the war, watched these developments with growing concern. American public opinion was deeply divided between isolationists who wanted to avoid European entanglements and interventionists who believed Nazi Germany represented a threat that would eventually reach American shores. Both sides waged fierce propaganda campaigns within America, with isolationist groups like the America First Committee arguing that the war was not America's concern, while groups supporting aid to Britain warned of the dangers of Nazi victory. The Roosevelt administration, increasingly convinced that America would need to enter the war, walked a careful line, providing material support to Britain through programs like Lend-Lease, while preparing American public opinion for eventual involvement. The Nazi government also targeted American audiences, attempting to reinforce isolationist sentiment and portray Britain as a declining imperial power unworthy of American support. German agents and sympathizers spread anti-war and anti-British messages through various channels, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful as most Americans, while reluctant to enter the war, found Nazi ideology repugnant. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the psychological landscape of the war shifted dramatically. The attack, which destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet and killed thousands of servicemen, shocked the United States out of its ambivalence. The infamous Day of Infamy speech by President Roosevelt, delivered to Congress and broadcast to the nation, crystallized American anger and determination. Almost overnight, American industry and society mobilized for total war, and the psychological challenge became not convincing Americans to fight but channeling their energy effectively and sustaining their commitment through what would be a long and costly struggle. While radio waves carried voices across borders, another form of psychological warfare literally rained down from the sky. Leaflets, simple pieces of printed paper, became one of the most widespread tools of psychological operations during World War II. Aircraft from all sides dropped millions upon millions of these paper messengers over enemy lines, occupied territories, and even deep into enemy homelands. The messages varied widely depending on the target audience and objectives. Some leaflets aimed at enemy soldiers attempted to undermine their will to fight by emphasizing the hopelessness of their situation, the superiority of the opposing forces, or the betrayal of their leaders who lived in comfort while sending young men to die. Others provided safe conduct passes, promising fair treatment to soldiers who surrendered. Some highlighted the suffering of families back home, appealing to soldiers' natural desire to survive and return to loved ones. Leaflets aimed at civilian populations in occupied territories sought to maintain hope and resistance, providing news that contradicted official propaganda and reminding people that liberation would eventually come. The Germans dropped leaflets over Allied lines attempting to sow division, highlighting class differences, racial tensions, and political disagreements that might weaken unity. They created sophisticated forgeries of Allied safe conduct passes, but with subtle changes that would result in any soldier trying to use them being identified as a deserter. They produced leaflets aimed at colonial troops serving in Allied armies, attempting to foster resentment toward their European colonial masters and suggesting they were fighting for nations that oppressed their own people. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, conducted massive leaflet campaigns over Germany and occupied Europe. American bombers on missions over Germany often carried not only high explosives but bales of leaflets to scatter over cities and countryside. These paper messengers carried various messages as the war progressed. Early in the conflict, They often focused on undermining confidence in Nazi leadership and highlighting German military setbacks. As the war turned decisively against Germany, leaflets increasingly emphasized the inevitability of defeat and encouraged surrender as the only rational choice. Some leaflets were remarkably sophisticated, including reproductions of front pages from German newspapers with headlines altered to reveal truths the Nazi government suppressed. Others took simpler approaches, showing images of the destruction being visited upon German cities or listing the names of German soldiers confirmed as prisoners of war so their families would know they were alive. The effectiveness of leaflet campaigns is difficult to measure precisely, but evidence suggests they had significant impact. Interrogations of prisoners of war revealed that many had read and been influenced by Allied leaflets. Some soldiers kept safe conduct passes tucked in their uniforms, waiting for an opportunity to use them. German authorities' strenuous efforts to collect and destroy leaflets, and their harsh penalties for civilians caught reading or distributing them, indicate they took the threat seriously. In occupied countries, leaflets provided not only information but also a tangible reminder that the occupied nations had not been forgotten, that powerful allies were working toward liberation. This psychological boost to morale and resistance should not be underestimated, as it helped sustain the will to resist through the darkest years of occupation. Beyond propaganda aimed at influencing morale and attitudes, psychological warfare in World War II included elaborate deception operations designed to mislead enemy commanders about Allied intentions, capabilities, and plans. These operations recognized that the enemy's perception of reality could be as important as reality itself, and that controlling what the enemy believed could be a decisive advantage. The British established specialized units focused on strategic deception, most notably the London Controlling Section, which coordinated elaborate schemes across multiple theaters of war. One of the most famous deception operations, and indeed one of the most successful in military history, was Operation Fortitude, the plan to mislead the Germans about where and when the Allied invasion of Western Europe would occur. As preparations for D-Day advanced through 1943 and into 1944, Allied planners knew that achieving surprise was crucial to success. If German forces were concentrated at the actual landing sites in Normandy, the invasion could fail with catastrophic losses. Therefore, an elaborate multi-layered deception plan was created to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel, rather than the actual target in Normandy. The deception involved creating an entirely fictitious 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and based in southeastern England, perfectly positioned for an assault on Calais. The Germans, who respected and feared Patton, considered it logical that he would command the main invasion force. To make this phantom army appear real, the Allies constructed elaborate props including dummy landing craft, inflatable tanks, and fake encampments that looked genuine from the air. Radio operators sent streams of fictitious messages that German signals intelligence could intercept, creating the electronic signature of a massive military formation preparing for action. Real military units were stationed in southeastern England and conducted exercises and movements consistent with invasion preparation. Double agents, Germans who had been captured or turned and were now controlled by British intelligence, fed false information to their German handlers, all carefully coordinated to support the Calais deception. The Germans, receiving confirming information from multiple sources they believed were independent, became convinced that Calais was indeed the target. When the invasion finally came on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, German commanders, including Hitler himself, remained convinced for crucial days that this was a feint and that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. German forces that could have been rushed to Normandy remained in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The success of Operation Fortitude saved thousands of Allied lives and was critical to the establishment of the beachhead that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe. This operation demonstrated that psychological warfare and deception could achieve strategic results as significant as any conventional military operation. Similar deception operations were conducted in other theaters. In the Mediterranean, Operation Mincemeat involved planting false documents on a corpse that was then allowed to wash up on the Spanish coast, where British intelligence knew the information would reach German hands, successfully misleading the Germans about Allied invasion plans for Sicily. In the Pacific, similar deception operations were conducted on smaller scales, with fake radio traffic, misleading reconnaissance patterns, and planted intelligence, all used to keep Japanese commanders uncertain about American intentions. The Japanese themselves employed deception, particularly in their use of the Kaiten suicide torpedoes and kamikaze aircraft, tactics that were as much psychological as military. The shock value of these suicide attacks created terror and uncertainty among Allied forces, even though their actual military effectiveness was limited. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy willing to deliberately sacrifice their own lives was profound and disturbing to Western military personnel, representing a fundamentally different cultural approach to warfare that challenged their assumptions and required psychological adjustment. The home front battles. While soldiers fought on battlefields across the globe, civilians on all sides faced their own psychological struggles, and governments worked tirelessly to maintain morale, productivity, and commitment to the war effort. The home front became a critical battlefield in the psychological war, where propaganda, censorship, and mobilization of public opinion determined whether nations could sustain the enormous sacrifices required by total war. In Nazi Germany, the propaganda apparatus worked constantly to maintain support for the war even as conditions deteriorated. Early victories were celebrated with parades and triumphant newsreels, reinforcing the narrative of German superiority and inevitable triumph. As the tide turned and defeats mounted, the propaganda shifted emphasis, increasingly focusing on the dire consequences of losing the war and the necessity of fighting to the bitter end. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime, was largely hidden from the German public through euphemisms and secrecy, though many Germans were aware at some level of what was happening. The cognitive dissonance required to reconcile daily life with the horrors being perpetrated in the name of the German people created a psychological burden that manifested in various ways, from genuine ignorance through willful blindness to active participation or resistance. In Britain, the government faced the challenge of maintaining morale through years of hardship, from the Blitz through the flying bomb attacks later in the war, all while rationing created increasing scarcity of food and consumer goods. British propaganda emphasized themes of perseverance, community solidarity, and the righteousness of the cause. Posters urged citizens to carry on, to avoid spreading rumors, to contribute to the war effort through work and sacrifice. The Ministry of Information produced films that portrayed Britain as a united nation where class differences had been set aside in common purpose. An idealized vision that didn't fully match reality but provided an inspiring model to strive toward. Entertainment was carefully managed, with films, music, and radio programs designed to boost morale, while occasionally allowing people to forget the war for brief moments. Comedians like Tommy Trinder and entertainers like Vera Lynn became beloved figures whose performances provided psychological relief from constant stress and fear. Censorship was extensive but generally accepted by the public as a necessary wartime measure. Information about bombing damage, military casualties, and strategic setbacks was controlled to prevent despondency or useful intelligence reaching the enemy. At the same time, the government recognized that complete suppression of bad news would undermine credibility, so defeats were acknowledged while being framed in ways that minimized their psychological impact or emphasized silver linings. In the United States, entry into the war required a massive psychological shift for a nation that had been deeply isolationist just days before Pearl Harbor. The government established the Office of War Information to coordinate propaganda and information management both domestically and internationally. American propaganda tended to be more optimistic and idealistic than British messaging, emphasizing American values of freedom, democracy, and progress while portraying the enemy as antithetical to these values. Hollywood became a crucial ally in the psychological war effort, producing films that supported the war, portrayed America and its allies positively, and demonized the enemy. Directors like Frank Capra, who had previously made beloved films like It's a Wonderful Life, created the Why We Fight documentary series explaining the causes and objectives of the war to military personnel and civilians alike. These films used sophisticated cinematic techniques to create emotionally compelling narratives that justified American involvement and sacrifice. The government also worked to manage public expectations and maintain civilian commitment through what would be a longer war than many initially expected. After early optimism that the war might be won quickly, leaders like President Roosevelt emphasized the long, hard road ahead, preparing Americans psychologically for years of sacrifice. Rationing of food, gasoline, and consumer goods was implemented not only for practical reasons but as a way to involve every citizen in the war effort, creating a sense of shared sacrifice and purpose. Scrap metal drives, war bond campaigns, and victory gardens served similar functions, giving civilians concrete ways to contribute and feel invested in the outcome. The Soviet Union, which bore the brunt of German military power and suffered casualties that dwarfed those of the Western Allies, conducted its own massive psychological mobilization. Soviet propaganda emphasized patriotism, not just communist ideology, recognizing that nationalism was a more powerful motivator than abstract political theory when defending the motherland against invasion. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted nearly 900 days and cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives through starvation and bombardment, became a symbol of Soviet endurance and determination. Stories of heroic resistance, whether by soldiers like those who fought to the last man at various defensive positions or civilians who continued working in factories despite hunger and constant danger, were widely disseminated to inspire others. Soviet authorities also skillfully manipulated information about German atrocities, not inventing them but ensuring they were widely known to fuel hatred of the invaders and determination to drive them out regardless of cost. At the same time, negative information about Soviet defeats, the incompetence of military leadership in the early years of the war, and the brutal methods Stalin used to maintain control were suppressed. Soldiers who retreated were labeled traitors or cowards, with blocking detachments positioned to shoot their own troops if they fell back without authorization. This terror created a grim calculus where soldiers sometimes faced greater danger from their own commanders than from the enemy, a psychological burden that reinforced the desperation of Soviet resistance. Psychological operations in the Pacific Theater. The war in the Pacific presented unique challenges for psychological operations due to vast distances, diverse cultures, and the particular characteristics of Japanese military culture and ideology. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with the Bushido code of warrior honor that emphasized loyalty unto death and portrayed surrender as the ultimate shame. Early in the war, American forces discovered that Japanese soldiers would often fight to the death rather than surrender, and that wounded Japanese soldiers sometimes carried out suicide attacks on medical personnel attempting to help them. This created a vicious psychological cycle where American troops became reluctant to take prisoners or offer quarter, which in turn reinforced Japanese beliefs that surrender meant torture and death at American hands. American psychological operations in the Pacific thus faced extraordinary difficulties. Standard leaflet campaigns offering safe conduct and good treatment to prisoners of war had limited effect because most Japanese soldiers either didn't believe the promises or considered surrender unacceptable regardless of assurances. However, as the war progressed and Japan's situation became increasingly hopeless, some psychological warfare efforts began to show results. Leaflets that avoided explicitly calling for surrender but instead provided information about the true state of the war, contradicting Japanese propaganda claims of victory, proved somewhat more effective. Messages that acknowledged the honor of Japanese soldiers while suggesting that continuing hopeless resistance served no purpose sometimes persuaded soldiers to cease fighting even if they couldn't bring themselves to formally surrender. The most successful American psychological operation in the Pacific involved the use of Japanese prisoners of war and captured documents to understand Japanese military thinking and create more effective propaganda. Interrogation revealed that many Japanese soldiers were motivated not by fanatical devotion to the emperor, but by more relatable concerns like loyalty to comrades, sense of duty, and desire not to bring shame on their families. Armed with these insights, American psychological warfare specialists crafted messages that worked within Japanese cultural frameworks rather than against them. One particularly effective approach involved letters from Japanese prisoners of war to former comrades, describing their good treatment and suggesting that honorable service had been fulfilled, making further resistance unnecessary. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, whatever their military necessity or moral implications, functioned as overwhelming psychological weapons that demonstrated American capability to destroy Japan completely without invasion. The emperor's radio address announcing surrender, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice, carried tremendous psychological weight precisely because it came from the figure they had been taught to revere as a living deity. His human voice acknowledging defeat helped many Japanese accept the previously unthinkable reality of surrender. American propaganda aimed at Pacific territories occupied by Japan faced different challenges than operations targeting Japanese military personnel. In the Philippines, where the population had generally been supportive of American administration before the war, maintaining morale and organizing resistance required assurance that liberation would come and that Filipino sacrifice was not forgotten. General Douglas MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return," became a powerful psychological symbol of American commitment, and when he did return, the propaganda value was enormous, demonstrating American reliability and power. In other occupied territories, particularly in Southeast Asia where colonial subjects had experienced European imperial rule, Japanese propaganda initially had some success portraying the conflict as Asian liberation from Western colonialism under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. However, the brutal reality of Japanese occupation, which often proved harsher than previous colonial administration, undermined these messages. Allied propaganda highlighting Japanese atrocities and contrasting them with promises of eventual independence under Allied supervision gradually eroded support for Japanese rule, though anti-colonial nationalism remained a powerful force that would reshape the post-war world. The resistance and underground information networks. In occupied territories across Europe and Asia, resistance movements waged their own psychological warfare campaigns against occupying forces and collaborationist governments. These efforts, conducted under constant threat of discovery and brutal reprisals, demonstrated the power of ideas to sustain hope even in the darkest circumstances. Underground newspapers, printed secretly on hidden presses and distributed at tremendous risk, provided occupied populations with news beyond that allowed by censors. These publications served multiple psychological functions, maintaining connection with the outside world, preserving national identity and culture under threat of erasure, and demonstrating that resistance continued despite apparent enemy control. In France, hundreds of underground newspapers circulated during the German occupation, with titles that reflected defiance and determination. These papers reported on Allied military successes, exposed collaborators, reprinted BBC broadcasts for those who lacked radios or dared not risk listening, and maintained French cultural life through poetry, commentary, and humor that mocked the occupiers. Similar underground press operations flourished in Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, and other occupied nations. The psychological impact extended beyond the information conveyed. The mere existence of these publications proved that the occupiers' control was not absolute, that resistance was possible, and that people were willing to risk everything to maintain truth and dignity. Resistance movements also engaged in psychological warfare operations against the occupying forces themselves. Graffiti appeared overnight on walls, symbols of resistance that could not be completely prevented despite patrols and curfews. Small acts of sabotage, while causing limited physical damage, created uncertainty and fear among occupation troops who never knew when or where the next attack might come. Targeted assassinations of collaborators and occupation officials served not only to remove individuals but to send messages to others that collaboration carried consequences and that the resistance was capable and determined. The occupiers responded with collective punishments and brutal reprisals, calculated to make populations too frightened to support resistance, but these measures often backfired psychologically, increasing resentment and determination while providing fresh atrocities for Allied propaganda to highlight. In Eastern Europe, where resistance movements became large-scale guerrilla armies, particularly in Yugoslavia and Poland, the psychological dimension of their operations significantly complicated German efforts to maintain control. Occupation forces could never feel secure, never completely trust local populations, and had to divert substantial resources to anti-partisan operations that would otherwise have been available for frontline combat. The knowledge that resistance continued, that occupied peoples had not accepted their fate, provided hope that sustained civilian morale through years of hardship and danger. Special operations units like the British Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services, forerunner to the CIA, supported these resistance movements with supplies, training, and coordination while conducting their own psychological operations. Agents parachuted behind enemy lines to organize sabotage, gather intelligence, and support local resistance movements, their very presence serving as tangible evidence of Allied commitment to liberation. These organizations also conducted black propaganda operations, creating materials that purported to come from German sources but actually contained demoralizing or misleading information. Fake German military newspapers, official-looking orders that created confusion, and forged documents that sowed distrust among German units all fell under this category. The psychological impact of these operations was amplified by their very deceptiveness, as German authorities could never be entirely certain which information was genuine and which was Allied fabrication, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt that undermined the certainty and confidence essential to effective military operations. The final year and collapse of German morale. By 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having pushed German armies back from the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad all the way to Poland and beyond. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy and were fighting their way toward Germany's borders. Italy, Germany's major European ally, had already surrendered and switched sides. German cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing, British bombers by night and American bombers by day, creating destruction on a scale unprecedented in human history. The psychological impact of this strategic bombing campaign on German civilians was profound and multifaceted. The Allies hoped, perhaps naively, that bombing German cities would break civilian morale and undermine support for the war, forcing the German government to sue for peace. In reality, the bombing had complex effects. It certainly caused tremendous suffering, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and disrupted industrial production. Survivors often exhibited symptoms of trauma, and the constant stress of air raids took a psychological toll that manifested in various ways from resignation to defiant determination. However, the bombing did not cause the collapse of civilian morale that Allied planners had hoped for. Instead, it often hardened attitudes, creating a sense that Germany was fighting for survival against enemies bent on total destruction. Nazi propaganda effectively exploited images of destroyed homes and dead children to portray the Allies as barbaric terrorists waging war on innocents. The psychological impact was perhaps greatest not in breaking morale but in demonstrating German impotence, as the regime that had promised security and greatness proved unable to protect its own cities and people. Goebbels, recognizing that maintaining the will to fight was becoming increasingly difficult as military defeat loomed, shifted propaganda strategies. He promoted the concept of total war, calling for every German to contribute to the struggle with fanatical determination. He emphasized that Germany faced a fight for survival, that defeat would mean the annihilation of the German nation and people, and that therefore no sacrifice was too great and no hope too desperate to cling to. Promises of miracle weapons, the V-rockets and jet aircraft that would turn the tide, were promoted despite their limited actual military impact. The notion that internal enemies, particularly Jews, were responsible for Germany's difficulties was intensified, even as the Holocaust reached its most intensive phase. As Soviet forces approached Germany proper, propaganda highlighted real and exaggerated Soviet atrocities against German civilians, creating terror that motivated desperate resistance in the East even as German forces in the West sometimes surrendered more readily to Western allies. The psychological state of Germany in the final year of the war was complex and tragic. Many Germans recognized that defeat was inevitable, but continued fighting from a mixture of residual loyalty, fear of what defeat would bring, automatic obedience to authority, and simple absence of alternatives. Others, particularly Nazi true believers, genuinely thought that some miracle might yet save them or that going down fighting was preferable to surrender. Resistors within Germany, including those who attempted to assassinate Hitler in the July 20th plot, hoped to end the war and salvage something from the catastrophe, but their failure and the brutal repression that followed effectively ended organized resistance within the German military and government. Allied psychological warfare in the final phase focused on accelerating German collapse by emphasizing the hopelessness of continued resistance and the relative mercy that could be expected from Western Allied occupation compared to Soviet. Leaflets and broadcasts reminded German soldiers and civilians that they faced a choice between pointless death in a lost cause or survival into a post-war future. The unconditional surrender policy, however, complicated these efforts, as it gave no basis for Germans to hope that negotiation might preserve something of the German state or mitigate the consequences of defeat. Some historians argue this prolonged the war by making Germans feel they had no choice but to fight on. Others contend that Nazi Germany's criminal regime deserved no negotiated settlement, and that anything less than unconditional surrender would have allowed dangerous elements to survive and potentially regroup. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, after Hitler's suicide and with Soviet forces occupying Berlin, the psychological state of the German population was one of exhausted relief mixed with dread about what would come next. The careful psychological preparation that had sustained the war effort through years of increasing hardship had finally crumbled, not through any single brilliant Allied psychological operation but through the cumulative weight of overwhelming defeat and the collapse of the Nazi state that had demanded such sacrifices. The Nuremberg trials and justice as psychological warfare. The decision by the Allied powers to prosecute major Nazi war criminals in public trials rather than simply executing them represented a form of psychological warfare aimed not at winning the war, which had already been won, but at winning the peace and establishing principles for the post-war world. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and continued for years in various forms, served multiple psychological and propaganda purposes. They documented Nazi crimes in meticulous detail, creating an official historical record that would be difficult for future revisionists to deny. The testimony of victims and documentation of the Holocaust served to educate a world that was only beginning to grasp the full extent of Nazi atrocities. The trials also aimed to delegitimize Nazi ideology by holding its proponents personally accountable, demonstrating that following orders or acting on behalf of a state did not excuse participation in crimes against humanity. For the German people, the trials presented a complicated psychological challenge. On one hand, they forced confrontation with the crimes committed in Germany's name, creating collective shame and guilt that would shape German national identity for generations. On the other hand, the focus on Nazi leadership allowed ordinary Germans to distance themselves from responsibility, fostering a narrative that they had been deceived or coerced by a criminal regime rather than active participants in or beneficiaries of its crimes. The trials were carefully stage-managed for psychological impact, with simultaneous translation technology allowing real-time testimony in multiple languages, newsreel footage distributed globally, and careful documentation provided to journalists. The image of Nazi leaders, who had once seemed so powerful and threatening, sitting in the dock facing justice, provided powerful symbolic reassurance that evil, no matter how strong it might appear, would ultimately be held accountable. The establishment of principles of international law, including the novel concept of crimes against humanity, represented an idealistic vision of a post-war order based on universal human rights rather than pure power politics. These principles were partly propaganda, as the selective application of international law would become apparent during the Cold War, but they also represented genuine aspirations that would influence human rights discourse and international relations for decades. In Japan, similar trials were conducted, most notably the Tokyo trials, which prosecuted Japanese military and political leaders for war crimes and crimes against peace. These trials were more controversial in some respects, particularly regarding the decision not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito, who was instead retained as a symbol of Japanese continuity and legitimacy, a decision made largely for psychological and political reasons related to maintaining stability during occupation and reconstruction. The birth of the Cold War and lessons learned. Even before World War II ended, the psychological warfare that had been waged against the Axis powers began to be redirected toward a new ideological conflict between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. The marriage of convenience that had united capitalist and communist powers against fascism began to dissolve as victory approached, and both sides maneuvered for advantage in the post-war world. The psychological dimensions of this emerging Cold War drew heavily on lessons learned during the global conflict just concluded. Both sides understood the power of propaganda, the importance of controlling information, and the potential to undermine enemy societies from within through psychological operations. The Soviet Union, having suffered tremendously during the war with an estimated 27 million dead, was determined to create a buffer of friendly states in Eastern Europe to prevent future invasions from the West. The Western Allies, increasingly alarmed by Soviet expansionism and the brutality of Stalin's regime, sought to contain communist influence and promote democratic capitalism. The psychological battlefield shifted from defeating fascist aggression to competing for the hearts and minds of people worldwide, particularly in the developing world where decolonization was creating new nations that both sides courted. The United States established permanent psychological warfare capabilities that would have been unthinkable before the war. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, included extensive covert action and propaganda capabilities. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were established to broadcast to audiences behind the Iron Curtain, continuing the psychological warfare techniques developed during the war. The United States Information Agency coordinated American public diplomacy and propaganda efforts worldwide. The Soviet Union similarly maintained extensive propaganda operations through organs like Radio Moscow and various front organizations, and the KGB's Active Measures Department conducted sophisticated psychological operations and disinformation campaigns. The techniques pioneered during World War II, from leaflet drops to radio broadcasts to strategic deception, all found new applications in Cold War contexts. Both sides supported proxy forces in conflicts around the globe, providing not just military aid but also training in propaganda and psychological operations. The Korean War and later the Vietnam War would demonstrate how the psychological dimension of conflict had become permanently integrated into modern warfare, with battles for public opinion at home and abroad sometimes mattering as much as military engagements on the ground. The development of nuclear weapons added a new psychological dimension to international relations. The concept of mutually assured destruction meant that direct conflict between superpowers could lead to human extinction, making the psychological components of deterrence and maintaining credibility paramount. Each side worked to appear strong, resolute, and slightly unpredictable enough that the other would not risk pushing confrontation too far. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 represented the terrifying culmination of this psychological brinkmanship, with the world coming perilously close to nuclear war before both sides stepped back from the precipice. The resolution of that crisis taught leaders that managing perceptions and providing face-saving ways out of confrontations was as important as military capabilities. Throughout the Cold War, the psychological warfare lessons of World War II remained relevant. The importance of credibility in propaganda, the power of symbols and narratives, the value of understanding cultural contexts and psychological motivations, and the recognition that wars are fought as much in minds as on battlefields, all shaped how the superpowers competed for over 4 decades. The Holocaust's psychological dimensions. Among the most profound and disturbing psychological aspects of World War II was the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of others including Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The psychological dimensions of this genocide operated on multiple levels, from the indoctrination that made it possible to the trauma it inflicted on survivors and the horror it revealed about human nature. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had spent years dehumanizing Jews, portraying them through pseudoscientific racism as fundamentally different from and dangerous to Aryan Germans. This psychological groundwork was essential to making ordinary Germans willing to accept first discrimination, then deportation, and finally mass murder. By constantly depicting Jews as parasites, disease vectors, and conspirators against German interests, Nazi propaganda created psychological distance that made it easier for people to ignore or accept atrocities they might have rejected if the victims had been portrayed as fully human. The incremental nature of persecution also played a psychological role, as each step, while shocking at first, became normalized before the next escalation occurred. This pattern made it psychologically easier for people to rationalize each new measure as not much worse than what had already been accepted. For the perpetrators, various psychological mechanisms enabled participation in genocide. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology who genuinely saw Jews as threats deserving elimination. Others compartmentalized their actions, separating their murderous work from their self-conception as decent people. The diffusion of responsibility within bureaucratic systems allowed individuals to see themselves as merely following orders or playing small roles in processes whose full implications they claimed not to grasp. The normalization of violence within institutions like the SS created subcultures where brutality was expected and rewarded while mercy was seen as weakness. Alcohol was often provided to execution squads to dull psychological resistance to mass killing. The transition from shooting victims face to face to using gas chambers was partly motivated by the psychological toll that direct killing took even on hardened killers, suggesting that some residual humanity persisted even among perpetrators of genocide. For victims, the psychological trauma began long before physical violence, with systematic stripping away of rights, property, social ties, and human dignity. The concentration camp system was designed not merely to kill but to psychologically destroy, to reduce human beings to desperate animals focused solely on survival. The capos, prisoners given authority over other prisoners, represented a particularly cruel psychological weapon, forcing victims to participate in their own oppression and creating divisions that hindered solidarity and resistance. The psychological aftermath of the Holocaust has reverberated through generations. Survivors carried trauma that often manifested in complex ways, from an inability to speak about experiences to intrusive memories and nightmares, emotional numbing, and profound grief from murdered loved ones and destroyed communities. Children of survivors often absorbed their parents' trauma in ways that shaped their own psychologies, a phenomenon that has been extensively studied. For the broader world, the Holocaust revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, about how ordinary people could participate in or acquiesce to extraordinary evil, about the fragility of civilization and morality in the face of determined ideology and state power. The psychological impact included a profound questioning of Enlightenment assumptions about progress and reason, recognition that education and culture were not sufficient safeguards against barbarism, and determination, however imperfectly realized, that such horrors must never be allowed to happen again. The phrase "never again" became a moral commitment grounded in psychological understanding that preventing future genocides required not just laws and institutions but constant vigilance against the psychological processes that enable mass atrocities. Post-war reconstruction and denazification. The psychological challenges did not end with military victory but instead transformed into questions of how to rebuild shattered societies and prevent the ideologies that had caused such devastation from reemerging. In Germany, the Allied occupation authorities implemented denazification programs intended to purge Nazi ideology from German society and re-educate the population in democratic values. This effort faced enormous practical and psychological challenges. Millions of Germans had been Nazi Party members, either from conviction or pragmatic necessity in a totalitarian state. Determining who was genuinely committed to Nazi ideology versus who had joined opportunistically or under coercion was nearly impossible. The most obvious war criminals and high-ranking Nazis could be prosecuted, but the vast middle ranks of party members and bureaucrats who had enabled the regime presented a more complex problem. Strict denazification would have removed so many people from positions in government, education, business, and other sectors that German society could not have functioned. The compromise that emerged was pragmatic but psychologically unsatisfying, with many former Nazis eventually returning to positions of influence after perfunctory denazification proceedings, while others were punished harshly for actions that seemed little different from those of unpunished peers. The psychological project of denazification also included re-education programs aimed at instilling democratic values and confronting Germans with the crimes committed in their name. Germans were required to watch films documenting concentration camp atrocities, to read accounts of Nazi crimes, and to attend lectures on democracy and human rights. The psychological impact of this forced confrontation varied. Some Germans underwent genuine transformations in understanding and accepted responsibility for their nation's crimes. Others resented what they saw as victors' justice and propaganda, maintaining that Nazi crimes had been exaggerated or that Germany had suffered enough through defeat and occupation. Many fell into a complicated middle ground, acknowledging that terrible things had happened while maintaining their own innocence and focusing on German suffering during the war and its aftermath. The concept of collective guilt, promoted by some Allied authorities and intellectuals, was psychologically challenging and morally complex. Could an entire nation be held responsible for the crimes of its government? Was a child who had been indoctrinated in Nazi youth organizations morally culpable? These questions had no easy answers but demanded psychological wrestling with issues of responsibility, complicity, and the possibility of redemption and reconciliation. In Japan, similar psychological challenges arose. The American occupation under General MacArthur sought to transform Japanese society from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy, a project that required fundamental psychological and cultural change. The decision to retain Emperor Hirohito, who had been portrayed in Allied propaganda as a war criminal, was made for psychological and practical reasons, as American authorities believed the emperor's endorsement was essential for Japanese acceptance of occupation and reform. This compromise meant that the psychological confrontation with responsibility for Japanese aggression and war crimes was less thorough than in Germany, with many Japanese viewing themselves primarily as victims, particularly of the atomic bombings, rather than as aggressors whose military had committed extensive atrocities across Asia. the suppression of traditional militaristic values and the promotion of pacifism, enshrined in Japan's post-war constitution which renounced war as a sovereign right, represented a massive psychological and cultural shift that shaped Japanese national identity in the post-war era. The economic focus that replaced military ambition channeled Japanese national energy into rebuilding and economic development, creating the so-called Japanese economic miracle that would make Japan one of the world's wealthiest nations by the late 20th century. The long shadow of psychological warfare. The psychological warfare techniques developed and refined during World War II have continued to shape conflicts and international relations into the present day. The recognition that perception often matters as much as reality in international affairs, that public opinion is a strategic resource to be cultivated and protected, and that undermining enemy morale and cohesion can be as valuable as destroying enemy forces, all became permanent features of how nations approach conflict. The Vietnam War demonstrated both the power and limits of psychological operations. American forces conducted extensive psychological warfare operations in Vietnam, from leaflet drops to village loudspeaker broadcasts to programs like Chiu Hoi that encouraged Viet Cong defection. Some of these operations achieved tactical successes, but ultimately American psychological operations could not overcome the fundamental problems of a war whose purposes were unclear to many Americans and whose conduct often contradicted the values America claimed to represent. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong propaganda and psychological operations effectively exploited American cultural divisions, contributing to the erosion of domestic support that eventually made continued American involvement politically impossible. The images of the war, broadcast into American homes through television news, created a psychological impact that Pentagon censors could not control, demonstrating that in an age of mass media, controlling the narrative was increasingly difficult. The psychological dimension of terrorism, which became increasingly prominent in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, reflects lessons learned in World War II and subsequent conflicts. Terrorist groups recognize that the psychological impact of violence often exceeds its direct physical effects, that creating fear and provoking overreaction can serve strategic purposes, and that modern media amplifies these effects by spreading images and news of attacks globally and instantaneously. The September 11th attacks on the United States in 2001 exemplified this dynamic, with relatively small numbers of attackers creating psychological shockwaves that reshaped global politics and led to wars that have lasted decades. The American response, including the global war on terror and conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, involved extensive psychological operations aimed at winning hearts and minds in Muslim-majority countries while maintaining domestic support for military operations. These efforts met with mixed success at best, suggesting that psychological warfare alone cannot overcome fundamental political and cultural challenges or substitute for coherent strategy and achievable objectives. The rise of social media and the internet has created new battlegrounds for psychological warfare, with state and non-state actors conducting influence operations through fake accounts, disinformation campaigns, and sophisticated manipulation of algorithms and human psychology. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its ongoing conflict in Ukraine have featured extensive psychological and information warfare alongside conventional military operations, with fake news, hacked documents, and troll farms all employed to confuse, demoralize, and manipulate target audiences. China has developed sophisticated capabilities in what it calls the three warfares of psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare, employing these tools to advance its interests in disputes with neighbors and in its long-term competition with the United States. The techniques pioneered during World War II, suitably updated for modern technology and social contexts, remain central to how nations and groups compete and conflict. The recognition that wars are fought in minds as much as on battlefields, that perception shapes reality, and that understanding and influencing human psychology is a strategic imperative, all trace back to lessons learned during humanity's most destructive conflict. The veterans' burden and collective memory. The millions of soldiers who fought in World War II returned home carrying psychological burdens that would affect them and their families for decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet named as such during the immediate post-war period, affected vast numbers of veterans who had experienced the horrors of combat, witnessed atrocities, or participated in violence that haunted their memories. Many veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, finding that the people back home could not understand what they had experienced and that the skills and mindset required for survival in combat were maladaptive in peacetime. Some turned to alcohol or other means of numbing their pain. Others found that their families had changed during their absence, that relationships had been strained or broken, and that the home they had idealized during the war no longer matched reality. Societies struggled with how to honor veteran service while helping them heal and reintegrate. Memorial ceremonies, veterans organizations, and benefits programs served psychological as well as practical functions, acknowledging sacrifice and providing community among those who shared the experience of war. The collective memory of World War II, how societies chose to remember and commemorate the war, became a psychological and political battleground in its own right. In the Western democracies, particularly the United States and Britain, the war was remembered as a clear moral struggle against evil, a good war where sacrifice had been meaningful and victory righteous. This narrative, while containing important truths, also simplified a more complex reality and sometimes obscured uncomfortable aspects like the strategic bombing of civilian populations, the forced relocation of Japanese Americans, or the compromises with Soviet totalitarianism. In Germany, the process of confronting the Nazi past has been long and painful, involving generations of debate about responsibility, memory, and how to acknowledge crimes without allowing them to define national identity forever. The concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, became central to German culture and politics. In Japan, the memory of the war has been more contested, with periodic controversies over textbook portrayals of Japanese aggression. Visits by political leaders to the Yasukuni Shrine where war criminals are honored alongside other war dead, and insufficient acknowledgement of atrocities like the rape of Nanking and the use of comfort women. In the former Soviet Union and later Russia, the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is known there, became a central element of national identity and pride, with Victory Day celebrated annually with massive military parades and genuine public emotion. The narrative emphasizes Soviet heroism and sacrifice while often minimizing cooperation with Western allies and suppressing uncomfortable truths about Stalin's regime, the Soviet-Nazi pact that preceded the German invasion, and Soviet war crimes. In Eastern European nations caught between Nazi and Soviet occupation, memory of the war is complicated by the fact that liberation from Nazi rule meant subjugation under Soviet communism, creating conflicting narratives about who were liberators and who were oppressors. These contested memories demonstrate how the psychological impact of the war continues to shape national identities and international relations many decades after the fighting ended. The question of how to remember, what to emphasize, and what to acknowledge remains contested because memory is not merely about the past but shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the world in the present. Lessons for understanding human nature. Perhaps the most profound psychological legacy of World War II lies in what it revealed about human nature itself, both humanity's capacity for evil and its capacity for resilience, courage, and moral action even in the darkest circumstances. The war demonstrated that ordinary people, given certain conditions of propaganda, social pressure, diffusion of responsibility, and ideological justification, could participate in or acquiesce to extraordinary atrocities. The psychological distance created by bureaucracy, technology, and dehumanizing propaganda allowed people to commit acts they might have found impossible in more direct, personal contexts. This understanding has influenced fields from psychology to political science to ethics, generating research on conformity, obedience to authority, moral disengagement, and the social psychology of evil. Experiments like those conducted by Stanley Milgram on obedience and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison experiment, however controversial their methods, were directly inspired by questions about how ordinary Germans could have participated in the Holocaust. The understanding that evil is often banal, perpetrated by ordinary people following orders and routines rather than by monsters, represents a disturbing but essential insight into human psychology that the war revealed. At the same time, the war also demonstrated humanity's remarkable resilience and capacity for moral courage. Individuals like Oskar Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, and countless others whose names were never recorded risked their own lives to save others, demonstrating that moral action remained possible even under totalitarian regimes that punished it. Resistance movements across occupied Europe showed that the human spirit could not be entirely crushed by oppression. Survivors of concentration camps who managed to maintain their humanity and later rebuild their lives testified to remarkable psychological resilience. Communities that came together to support each other through bombing, privation, and loss demonstrated the power of solidarity and mutual aid. Veterans who, despite their trauma, managed to return to productive lives and build families and communities showed healing was possible even after profound psychological wounds. The war revealed that human psychology is complex and variable, that we contain potentials for both terrible evil and remarkable good, and that circumstances, culture, and individual choices all matter in determining which potentials manifest. The recognition that psychological factors could determine the outcomes of conflicts as surely as military strength led to the development of entirely new fields of study and practice. Military psychology became a recognized discipline, focusing on training, morale, leadership, and the psychological aspects of combat. Political psychology emerged to study how psychological factors influence political behavior, both individual and collective. The field of peace studies developed partly in response to the horrors of World War II, seeking to understand the causes of war and pathways to peace through interdisciplinary approaches that included psychological perspectives. The universal human rights framework that emerged after the war, codified in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, reflected psychological understanding that all humans share fundamental needs and dignities that must be protected. International humanitarian law developed further, attempting to place limits on the conduct of warfare and protect non-combatants, based partly on psychological understanding of the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even in conflict. These developments represent humanity's attempt to learn from the psychological dimensions of the war and create systems and knowledge that might prevent future catastrophes. The digital age and modern psychological warfare. In our present era, the psychological warfare techniques developed during World War II have evolved into forms that the war's participants could scarcely have imagined. The internet and social media have created an information environment where influence operations can be conducted at scale with minimal cost, where anyone with internet access can potentially reach global audiences, and where the distinction between truth and falsehood becomes increasingly blurred. State actors conduct sophisticated psychological operations through social media, using armies of bots and trolls to spread disinformation, amplify divisions, and manipulate public discourse. The Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election, whatever its ultimate impact on the outcome, demonstrated that psychological warfare in the digital age could target the very foundations of democratic societies, undermining trust in institutions, exacerbating social divisions, and creating confusion about basic facts. These operations drew on the same fundamental principles that governed psychological warfare in World War II: understanding target audiences, crafting messages to exploit existing fears and grievances, and using multiple channels to reinforce narratives. But the technology allowed these operations to be conducted with unprecedented precision and scale. Non-state actors, from terrorist groups to activist movements to commercial entities, also employ psychological warfare techniques in the digital age. Terrorist organizations like ISIS used sophisticated media operations to recruit followers, intimidate enemies, and project an image of strength and religious legitimacy, producing slick videos and maintaining social media presence that rivaled state propaganda operations. Social movements use digital tools to organize, spread their messages, and put psychological pressure on institutions to change, sometimes achieving remarkable successes as in the Arab Spring movements, though often with complicated outcomes. Commercial advertising and marketing have converged with psychological warfare techniques, using behavioral psychology, big data, and targeted messaging to influence consumer behavior in ways that raise questions about manipulation and autonomy. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed how personal data could be weaponized for political psychological operations, using psychological profiling to target individuals with precisely tailored messages designed to manipulate their political behavior. The line between advertising, propaganda, and psychological warfare has become increasingly blurred in an age where the same techniques and technologies serve multiple purposes. The psychological impact of living in this information environment is only beginning to be understood. Studies suggest that constant exposure to conflicting information, deliberate disinformation, and emotionally charged content creates psychological stress, anxiety, and a sense that truth is unknowable. The phenomenon of truth decay, where societies lose shared standards for evaluating claims and distinguishing fact from fiction, represents a profound psychological and social challenge rooted partly in information warfare. The mental health impacts of social media, particularly on young people, include increased rates of anxiety, depression, and body image issues, suggesting that the psychological battlefield has extended into the most intimate aspects of personal identity and self-worth. The dopamine-driven feedback loops of social media platforms, the algorithmic amplification of engaging content regardless of its truth or social value, and the business models that profit from keeping users engaged and emotionally aroused, all create an environment where psychological manipulation is built into the architecture of modern communication. Understanding these dynamics requires grappling with the legacy of World War II psychological warfare, recognizing how techniques developed in that conflict have evolved and adapted to new technologies and social contexts. Reflections on memory and meaning. As we near the end of our journey through this hidden history, it's worth pausing to reflect on what the psychological dimensions of World War II mean for us today, living as we do in a world shaped by that conflict's legacies. The war demonstrated that truth is not self-evident and that determined efforts to manipulate perception can succeed, at least temporarily, in reshaping reality for millions of people. This knowledge should inspire both vigilance against manipulation and humility about our own susceptibility to psychological influence. We like to believe we would have resisted Nazi propaganda, that we would have seen through the lies and stood against evil, but the historical record suggests that most people in most circumstances conform to prevailing social norms and accept official narratives, especially when dissent is dangerous. Recognizing our own vulnerability is not cynicism but realism, and it should motivate us to create and maintain systems that protect truth-telling, reward critical thinking, and punish manipulation and disinformation. The institutions of free press, independent judiciary, academic freedom, and democratic governance that we often take for granted are psychological as well as political safeguards, creating spaces where competing narratives can be evaluated and truth can emerge through open inquiry rather than being dictated by power. The war also revealed the profound importance of meaning and narrative in human life. People endured extraordinary hardships and made tremendous sacrifices because they believed in the purposes for which they fought. When that sense of meaning was maintained through effective leadership, propaganda, and cultural narratives, societies demonstrated remarkable endurance. When meaning eroded or was revealed as hollow, even powerful military forces could collapse with surprising speed. This insight applies not only to warfare but to all collective human endeavors. Societies need shared narratives that give meaning to sacrifice and suffering, that connect individuals to larger purposes, and that provide hope that current difficulties serve future goods. When these narratives are absent or lose credibility, social cohesion weakens and cynicism spreads. The challenge is maintaining meaningful narratives that are not based on lies, scapegoating, or false promises, but instead draw on genuine shared values and realistic assessments of challenges and possibilities. The psychological warfare of World War II often involved manipulation and deception, but the most effective and enduring messages were those that connected to authentic values like freedom, dignity, justice, and protection of loved ones. A gentle closing. As the night deepens and our story draws to its close, let us remember that the invisible wars fought in minds and hearts during World War II were not separate from the physical battles but intimately connected to them, shaping outcomes and leaving scars that persist to this day. The young soldiers who huddled in foxholes, the civilians who endured bombing and occupation, the victims of genocide, the resistors who risked everything for principle, all fought their battles partly in the realm of psychology, maintaining hope, resisting despair, finding courage, grappling with fear and doubt. Their experiences remind us that human beings are psychological creatures, that our perceptions, beliefs, emotions, and narratives shape our actions as surely as material circumstances do. The propagandists, psychological warfare specialists, and leaders who sought to manipulate these inner worlds wielded real power, sometimes for necessary purposes and sometimes for evil ones. The techniques they developed continue to influence our world, adapted to new technologies and contexts but rooted in timeless aspects of human psychology. Understanding this hidden history helps us make sense of our present moment, where psychological warfare has not disappeared but evolved, where battles for hearts and minds continue through different means, and where the challenges of distinguishing truth from manipulation remain as urgent as ever. The story of psychological warfare in World War II ultimately reminds us that no war is purely physical, that every conflict involves competing narratives and psychological dimensions that help determine outcomes. It teaches us to be skeptical of official narratives without falling into cynical disbelief in all truth. It reveals both the darkness of which humans are capable when psychological mechanisms of empathy and moral reasoning are systematically undermined, and the light of courage and resilience that can persist even in the most terrible circumstances. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you not anxiety about manipulation but rather appreciation for the complexity of human psychology, awareness of how narratives shape our understanding of reality, and commitment to seeking truth while recognizing its sometimes elusive nature. The quiet battlefield of the mind, where so much of World War II was truly fought, remains contested territory in our own time. The weapons have changed, but the fundamental dynamics persist because they arise from human nature itself, from our reliance on social learning and communication, from our susceptibility to emotion and narrative, from our capacity for both self-deception and insight. May understanding this history help us navigate our own information environment with greater wisdom, maintaining the critical thinking and moral clarity that can serve as bulwarks against manipulation while preserving the openness to ideas and empathy for others that make us human. Rest now, knowing that the struggles of the past, however dark, also demonstrated human resilience and the possibility of learning from even our most terrible mistakes. The psychological battles of World War II shaped the world we inhabit, but they do not determine our future. That remains, as always, to be written by the choices we make and the meanings we create together.